absolutely delighted to see you today. And Charles, of course, Charles Gray. And the subject for her PhD is translation theory. Her areas of research include translation theory, Russian language, Russian symbolism, and history of ideas. And she's the author of 17 articles, so she tells me, published in Russian and English. And today she's going to talk on this most mysterious sounding topic: know thyself, from the temple of Apollo at Delphi to the pages of Petersburg.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ja, for your introduction, and also thank you very much that you sacrificed an hour of your life and decided to come to this seminar in this glorious spring day. Anyway, I thought that at this stage my article would be published because what we are talking about, it is a centenary celebration until the publication of Bieley's Petersburg in its so-called Syrian's edition. And the publisher sent me the cover, so it will be published. They promised this month, then another month, then probably in a month later. But what is going on, I'm trying to say that it is in the publishing house and it will appear soon. And this gives me a chance, how to put it, to draw a line in my life. Because I tried to do another PhD earlier in my life, and its result wasn't the one which I expected, and I struggled, and then I decided, okay, if these magic three letters mean so much to me, I need to make another attempt. So I moved to another subject from what I have done before. And before, I did my research on Russian symbolism in India. However, when I was approached by the editor of the book to submit an article as so-called a young Bieley scholar, I started to think, I have never written anything on Bieley's Petersburg because it is one of his novels which didn't provide data to my first PhD thesis. But because I was honored to make a contribution to this collection of articles, I started to think, how on earth I will manage to preserve my identity and to write something on the subject. And maybe the majority of you are not familiar with this novel because it is very, very difficult to read even in Russian. It is so-called an experimental prose. But when Nabokov was asked to give his list of books that he considers to be a distinguished contribution to world literature, he named only 4. And among these 4 is Bieley's Petersburg. His number 1 is James Joyce Ulysses. Number 2, Kafka's Metamorphosis. Number 3, Bieley's Petersburg. And number 4 is Marcel Proust in Searching of the Lost Time. So for Nabokov, no other novels at the beginning of the 20th century managed to make a valuable contribution into the development of literature. And still now, it is not such a well-established area. However, it is more to say it is a gray area to compare Ulysses with Petersburg, because Ulysses was written later than Petersburg. But there are some facts which might confirm the idea that somehow James Joyce met Andrei Bely, maybe not physically, but in theory, by somehow reading his work. Because there are many, many patterns in this experimental prose which create a special atmosphere of either in Ulysses or Petersburg. So, this is a kind of introduction, but I could not restrict myself not to mention that yesterday I went to a special event at UCL, and it was the first lecture, and it is gloriously called the Rabindranath Tagore Lecture, and it was organized by UCL Comparative Studies and Digital Humanities. And when I heard about this lecture, I started to think, what is all about? What they're going to do? So, at the end of the day, I did not spend my time for nothing. I got ideas how people can twist and develop their research in order to make money. But from ideas to practice, there is a huge gap. So what these people did, they analyzed millions and billions of bestseller novels. They put them through the machine, and then they found out what kind of words, the frequency of words. So they created a list of frequency of words, and if you have access to this list, take your pen or take your computer and start writing your bestseller novel. But of course, it works only for presentation, or it works only for publication, because of their results, I was very, very pleased to hear that the audience was divided, and it was divided into two parts based on their age. Young people adore this research, and there were distinguished professors there that had their reservations, because the major question was, so what? If you analyze that there are so many articles, indefinite articles in one particular work, and so many their articles in another type of work, you can't create a bestseller's work. So this was a nice experience. But anyway, from this experience, I also got a very nice formula how we can talk about our research. And usually, either it is always one or another, but not two together. But look, either it is who, we're researching who did what, then who did what, then where, then when, and then the most interesting, why. And also, there is research on how they did it. So I have already briefly mentioned who did this novel. What is this novel about? Again, I can quickly read the blurb. So the plot is a relatively simple one. Nikolai Apollonovich is ordered by a group of terrorists to assassinate his father, the prominent senator Apollon Apollonovich Obleukhov. Nevertheless, Bely's polyphonic experimental prose invokes such diverse themes as Greek mythology, the apocalypse, family dynamics, psychology, Russian history, theosophy, revolution, and European literary influences. Considered by Vladimir Nabokov to be one of the 20th century four greatest masterpieces, Petersburg is the first novel in which the city is the hero. Frequently compared to Joyce's Ulysses, no novel did more help launch modernism in the turn of the century Russia. So, I do not know, but somehow I covered this what? Where? In Russia, when? At the turn of the century. So I said that Last year we're supposed to have this volume being published to mark the centenary of its first appearance, but it is the second edition, so-called Syrian edition, and then it is the main question, why? So my presentation is two-folded to answer why, and then I'm not going to provide this the bestseller code how to write this experimental prose, but I will try to give some ideas how you can write an experimental prose. Okay, so this is how the cover of the book is supposed to look, and then the table of contents, and what could I say? If any piece of my other work on translation studies will be published in the company of these prominent scholars, I did not spend my life for nothing. So, Belly's contemporary Fyodor Stepun highly valued Belly's theoretical writing, in particular Belly's The Emblematics of Meaning. It's an article about the theory of symbolism. He pointed to the following characteristics of his work. Belly's thinking is an exercise on aerial bars, concealed under the dome of his lonely self. The acrobatics, however, is not an empty cerebral game. As in all acrobatics, a lot of hard work and mastery went into it. So, Belly's novel Petersburg is chosen as source of information in which further elements of his thinking are traced. Ideologically, the novel pays tribute to Belly's writing on the theory of symbolism, in particular to the contemporary theory of knowledge, but it also points to new developments in his views. Looking at Petersburg as a smooth rather than abrupt expansion of Belly's previous thinking, provides both challenging and advantages. Moreover, it gives an opportunity to portray Belly as an all-around thinker who is not hostile to or ignorant of a number of Oriental, predominantly Indian philosophical and religious ideas. Instead, he seems content to use them creatively in his literary piece. So, as I mentioned, there is a twofold purpose of my presentation. And now we are moving to the title, and I start to explain the title bit by bit, so hopefully by the end of my presentation you will have an idea what it's all about. So Belly might be called as a person of letters, because in comparison with many other writers, he happily wrote so many diaries. He was in correspondence with so many people that it creates, I do not know how many volumes still unpublished, to exemplify his thinking and also to trace the time in which he lived. And that's why I read many of them, and I worked in archives in Russia and in Switzerland as well, in order to find something which has not been discussed before. And what immediately struck me, it is his intention again and again to know himself. For him, the most interesting subject was he himself. And that's why he wrote a number of novels which contribute under the general title about himself. So about his childhood, then about his adulthood, and then moving on. So on one hand, people might think that he is a self-publicist, But if you approach this issue from another angle, you're able to understand that in order to understand the world, first of all, you need to understand yourself. And this was Bieley's idea, why he decided to study himself. And then I'll try to play with this hypothesis that Bieley was preoccupied with the idea to know himself. And immediately it created a bridge to, it created a bridge to Socrates' phrase. And then when I read it closely and meditated on this quote, I started to think that it was exactly that Bieley did all his life. And then it did not, yes, I found one confirmation of my hypothesis, but then I started to move, what else can it give me? Because my subject, not necessarily the theory of knowledge epistemology, but my subject is somehow to show how ideas travel around the world. And then I looked at what Bieley read before he wrote Petersburg. Yeah.
Thank you. Just a little.
Yeah. Probably it's too small printing, but anyway. And again, what is going on? First 10 years of the 20th century in Russia was a very interesting time, not because we started to move to the time of revolutions, but it was a time when the center of Indian studies was moved from Germany to St. Petersburg. And you can imagine that when this movement has been done, it was a Congress of Oriental Studies in St. Petersburg at the turn of the 20th century. And it created the whole interest in the subject, but not only scholars, but people who would like to read, say, not an easy literature. And these ideas were popular, and I am trying to convince people that when we talk about Russia at the turn of the century, it is not necessarily a division between Marxist ideas and, say, the preservation of the Tsar regime. There was always something else, and this something else, it sounds very, very strange, but the more I conduct my research, the more I understand that, yes, this something else is Nietzsche. And how it came to Russia, that suddenly Marxism, then the royal family, and then Nietzsche. Do not forget that Russia was always looking to Germany as a kind of the example of a cultural country. Here in Britain, the example is France. To Russians, it is Germany. Because Germans, the majority of our czars were from Germany. Our universities were established by German people. We worship theory only because of German people. And this idea of Nietzsche, again, if we read carefully Nietzsche, it is not destructive, it is constructive. His ideas are simply to change the order of things, but not to ruin things. It is how he sometimes has been interpreted. And this change, it is not a change on a physical level. It is a change on one's spiritual level. So in order to implement changes in the society, everybody should start with himself or herself. So it is a spiritual training in order to be ready for changes and in order to be ready for the new world. So these ideas of, sorry for my German pronunciation, Übermensch, and the New World, this is the ideas which were very, very interested for certain type of Russian intelligentsia who was not involved in the communist movement. And because they thought so much about the universe, about thinking, in spite of their numbers, in spite of their power, intellectual power, they lost the battle. So at the time before the revolution, I personally see that it was the battle of ideas between Marxism and people who believe in Nietzsche. And because Marxists are more practical, they won. So moving from Socrates to Nietzsche, what is going on? Mentioning that St. Petersburg was the center of Indian Indology or Indian studies in Europe at the beginning of the 20th century, and to be honest, and maybe even until now. Can you imagine that there were 2 volumes published before the revolution on the theory of knowledge in Buddhism and its logic, and barely read it. And there is evidence in his diaries, in his articles, in his manuscripts. And here, what was interested is the idea of perception. Because again, if you know, at the beginning of the 20th century, perception was a hot subject. And this perception was addressed from different angles. It was addressed by German philosophy, it was addressed by scholars of Indian philosophy, and it was also addressed by Theosophy, which was getting momentum at the turn of the 20th century. So, what kind of perception they were very interested in? So, for example, if I'll try to summarize Sherbatskoy's ideas about perception, I can find there 4 types, and they're all related to a particular Buddhist view on knowledge. The first 3 varieties, I came with an idea that in spite of the fact that Petersburg has never been evaluated from this perspective as something which has traces of Indian thought there, I decided to make this attempt. And I was also very happy to do it because it contributed to other novels which I analyzed from this perspective before. So what you see now, it is a very, very brief explanation what is Tattvam Asi. And my MPhil thesis showed that the cornerstone of Bailey's theory of symbolism, it is this principle. This principle can also be interpreted differently. It is an opportunity to know yourself, because we all, yes, we are human beings, but we have an opportunity to access on our path of spiritual development, to be very close to divinity. And this is how it can be done with a special practice of yoga, practice of meditation, and this all involves perception. And by mentioning this different stage of perception, I indicated that we need to start with ourselves. So, coming back to the novel, after all these philosophical introductions. So, it has been mentioned before that Bailey's novel, as well as many of his other works, are largely autobiographical. Petersburg is not an exception. The novel was written when Ася Turgenev became his partner and his affair with Lyubov Blok has already ended. And here it is a triangle. It was a triangle between two Russian poets and Lyubov Dmitrievna Blok. She was the wife of Alexander Blok, but then it was, okay, I have my reservations to make any comments on somebody's affairs because I have not been there. But based on what is written, there was an affair between Bely and Blok. And he suffered a lot because he could not drag Lyubov Dmitrievna Blok to his side and run away with her. However, he attempted a couple of times. But the damage to his personality was severe. And in order somehow to treat himself, he decided to write this novel. So my argument here that this novel is an attempt to meditate on his past in order to free himself and be ready to a new life. So the text of Petersburg provides evidence that Lyubov Dmitrievna Blok's image had moved to another level in Bely's mind. It came to exist above perception and matter. Just as she became a thought form, so he, who had been previously attached to her, became also a thought form. Insofar as both thought forms needed space to live, Petersburg accommodated them. In the novel, the city itself is also turned into a thought form. Perceptions associated with the Petersburg drama of Lyubov Dmitrievna and Bely have been transformed into visual images. Together with the main characters, other participants in the period of their liaison are also driven to another plane, to fiction. All of them manifest their own bodies and minds and life as verbal images in Petersburg. In the process of writing his novel, Bely meditated on his past and imagined himself as a yoga practitioner, using the terminology of later Buddhists, but not Theosophists. In other words, he inserted his recollections of the affair on the astral plane to know himself better. And also, by mentioning these thought forms, I'm making a link to Theosophy, and also if you see these thought forms, there is an understanding of perception from the later Buddhist point of view. But my point is that it was a meditation, and how he created the language. This experimental process, an opportunity for him to separate him from his image thoughts. And here is a quote from the novel, and it is the novel was translated, as far as I know, twice into English. For first time it was translated by American scholars of Andrei Bely, and this time now it is 8 years ago, it was translated by my former PhD supervisor, John Ellsworth. And for this translation, he got a translation prize. So it might give you an idea of what kind of language you can see in the novel. But what is also going on here, it's not only meditation on perception, it also the importance of using colors. And again, I trace this importance of using colors, how it developed, where it came from, and mentioning that Russians for centuries had this love affair with German culture. It came from Goethe, and Goethe borrowed it from Indians. and this is how ideas traveled. So every color has its own meaning, and using this spectrum of colors, writers can create this prose to add extra meaning to their sentences. But I'm not going to show this example to you. I'm showing you another example, and it is this quote. You might see it. So this is an example of so-called meditating on your image thought in order to free yourself from pain. I think that it might be a good idea if you look at the slide, and there you can see its English translation, but I will read you in Russian. «Сам себя он забыл, забыл свои мысли и забыл упование. Упивался собственной, ему предназначенной ролью. Богоподобное, бесстрастное существо отлетало куда-то. Оставалась голая страсть, а страсть стала ядом. Лихорадочный яд проницал его мозг, выливался незримо из глаз пламенеющим облаком, обвивая липнущим и кровавым атласом. Будто он теперь на все глядел обугленным ликом из пекущих тело огней. И обугленный лик превратился в черную маску, а текущее тело – огни в красный шелк. Он теперь воистину стал шутом, безобразным и красным. Так когда-то она сама называла его, мстительно, над какой-то своею ли правдою надругался теперь этот шут вероломно и остро, и опять-таки любил, ненавидел. So this passage does not have any names here. It has only pronouns. But what is going on here? So Belly portrayed himself as Nikolai Obleukhov, as a selfish, angry man. In this way, in his life, he tries to separate himself from his past. So it is this technique of using this image thought which you created. So as if you have a double. This Nikolai Obleukhov, the main character of Petersburg, is a double of Belly himself. So in order to free himself from his past, Belly created this novel where he meditates, trying to release his pain, to forget his past, and to separate him from this double, who is Nikolai Obleukhov. So what I have done so far is an opportunity to look at Petersburg through prism of Indian ideas, either in their original form or in their theosophical interpretation. One cannot estimate the importance in Belly's thinking. According to information provided by Bongard Levin in his publication on Block in India, in 1909, Indian philosophical ideas were so popular that the project was discussed between Belly and Metner to invite specialists on Indian philosophy and art to publish their work in the Journal of Musaget, Metner's publishing house. Citing and published correspondence with Belly and Metner, Bongard Levin names these specialists. They are Vera Johnston, a theosophist and translator, Sergei Oldenburg, a Russian Orientalist, professor of Buddhist studies and a member of the Russian Academy of Science, and Nikolai Rerich, an artist. Bongard Levin also argues that Belly had planned to write an article on Paul Deussen, a German Orientalist and Sanskrit scholar. The article has also explained Belly's contemporary studies of Oriental ideas and pointed to his reading of Sherbatskoy's work on the later Buddhists, in which the Buddhist theory of knowledge is discussed. The article has argued that behind Belly's reason for studying epistemology is his genuine interest in knowing himself better. In this context, looking at Petersburg as a novel that expresses words of approval for meditation provides a new approach. This approach highlights the presence of Indian elements in Belly's thinking and praises a technique that offers the opportunity to understand oneself in depth and to some extent to master one's life. Thank you very much for your attention.
thank Anna very much for really thought-provoking piece. Could I suggest before we go into questions, if you like a cup of coffee, you can get it now. Would that be, is that all right with you, Anna?
Yeah.
Well, can I get you a cup?
No, thank you. But late, I will do it later. Yeah, thank you.
Bad years. 14 bad years. Especially interpretation. No good years. 14 years of revising the syllabus. That's the curse of Joseph. It's not quite tea time. Yeah, there'll be something discussion.
Okay, I think we should probably start again because of the time. So can I invite questions, please?
I find it hugely difficult, I must say, to think at all about this spiritual transformation and to think of translating that into the context of pre-revolutionary Russia or Petersburg. And I know, for example, obviously that it was popular here as well. You mentioned Madame Blavatsky, or you mentioned Annie Besant, and you picked up theosophy around here. But I was wondering, because it's such a huge contrast to the political atmosphere, and you mentioned at the beginning, Marxism is such a very contrasting concept or approach to interpret life and interpret the world to whether there is a Russian tradition that he picks up on as well, whether there is something in Russian spiritualism, some system that influences this as well.
Yeah, the problems with Russians. I remember that once I made a talk on something similar, and then I heard in the audience, it was Russian Studies Congress, all those Russians, they do not have anything of their own. And I started to think, how on earth I'm able to make a comment on it, which I found very offensive, as if Russians always borrow something or steal something or things like this. And then I thought, and I decided, okay, now I will use my elements of Britishness. So I provide a very practical example, very easy example. So I look at this person and ask him, okay, let us list what kind of vegetables you need to make a soup. And the list is pretty the same in all cultures. To make a vegetable soup, you need potatoes, you need carrots, etc. But if we look at all these soups, each nation is able to contribute to world cuisine. They use the same ingredients, but the result is different. That is why probably Russian cuisine is famous for its shi or borscht, and any other cuisine, and French cuisine probably is famous for its onion soup, right? But ingredients are nearly the same. So how on earth it is possible to accuse one nation that it's borrowing or it's stealing ideas from another? No, we are not borrowing, we are not stealing. We use the same ingredients, but we use it according to the ways we are used to do. And speaking about these ideas, the time I am talking about, it's the time, say, before the Russian Revolution. And you might even imagine, or you might even not have enough imagination to imagine how many times during my life when I was a student at Moscow State University, I supposed to read all these texts about the Russian Revolution. At the end of the day, you become sick of it. You know all these facts, how according to the Soviet history. How revolution started, what was behind, why Lenin came, why all these groups were there, why they killed this and that. But look, not everybody participated in it. What the rest of them did. Similar to whenever I hear all these communists in the Soviet Union, and in my immediate reaction, do you know how many communists were there? In the population of 250 million, there were 16 million communists only. It is less than 1/10. So what other people were thinking about, what their ideas were. And obviously it was not like black or white. Either they were communists or they were anti-communists. No, there were different ideas. And I think that obviously I somehow shaped what has been published before me. I also formed very much of Berdyaev. And Berdyaev said that Russian intelligentsia lost in revolution simply because they thought too much about cosmos. They didn't think about their ordinary life. For them, ordinary life did not exist at all. Ideas were everything. So in their minds, it was a battle of ideas. When some of them supported the revolution, for them, it was the battle of ideas. It was an opportunity to show that they can create a new society. And maybe I'm trying to push these ideas quite strongly, but I will try another time because next month I'm going to attend a special event on Russian Revolution. And they invited to discuss the revolution from different perspectives. And I wrote my abstract as contribution of translators to the Russian Revolution. Because what is going on now, thank you to the head of European Society of Translation Studies, Anthony Pym. Now there is a great interest in the Russian theory of translation studies because one of its major textbook will be published soon. But this textbook was written in the 50s. Yes, it started, its preliminary form was in 30s and it was war, and then in the 50s. So since 1950s, it was, say, the Bible of translators, scholars in the USSR. But what was before, it is even more interesting. Because can you imagine, immediately after the revolution, it is like to imagine Syria now. The country is deeply in a bloody civil war. But what Russians did? They organized a huge publishing house to translate world literature. Where on earth they managed to find money? But because people who were these revolutionaries, they were also, say, first revolutionaries were well-educated people. What happened after Stalin, it's another story. Stalin was the minority of these revolutionaries. So they were romantics. They were very much loved Nietzsche. And that's why they decided, okay, we will show to the rest of the world that we are able to create a new man. And how it is possible to create a new man? Start educate them. So what Tony Blair said in 1996, it was said in Russia 70 years before him. No, 80 years before him. And it was, yes, talking about this comparison between Russia, revolutionary Russia, and Syria. Can you imagine now that somebody in Damascus will organize a publishing house with ideas to retranslate world literature simply because new citizens of new liberated Syria would like to know literature in a better translation that all these translations has been done for them before. So Gorky was in charge of this initiative. So this publishing house, Всемирная литература, all world literature, started to retranslate world literature. For instance, the huge project was to retranslate Shakespeare. In 1917, 1920, where on earth they could find money to do it? But in order to maintain this huge project, they're supposed to have armies of translators. And then it was the first educational setting in the 20th century, a translation school, part of this new publishing house. And then, in order to teach people, they're supposed to have textbooks. And somebody's supposed to write these textbooks. And there were two prominent people who contributed to creating this first textbook on translation in Soviet Russia. One of them was Kornei Chukovsky. After that, he had a prominent career as a writer, as a translator. He lived a very, very long life. His major work, The Art of Translation, was translated into English. But the second one, Nikolai Gumilev, who was a very interesting, in the best meaning of this word, poet, very adventurous person, a traveler, and also a husband of Anna Akhmatova. He wrote a section on how to write, how to translate poetry. But suddenly he was accused of being a terrorist, and he was killed by the government in 1921. So his contribution to translation studies evaporated because he was classified as a terrorist. And so what I'm trying to say, and why I decided to mention it to you, that it shows his work and his approach to translation studies, in particular to translate poetry, shows non-communist ideas, and at the same time, not so much ideas of the White Army. He could easily be part of the White Army, but he did not, because he was very much concerned in creating a new man, a new educated man. For these romantic people who participated in this first generation of revolutionaries, there were so many romantic people, but during all these political studies, their contribution was twisted as if they were communists or non-supporters of communists, but it was not that black and white. That's why so many intelligent people supported the revolution. That's why so many intelligent people from all over the world came to the Soviet Union. And I remember when I worked in a publishing house, my senior colleague, it was very difficult to find foreigners in the Soviet Union. So, but because I worked in a publishing house which translated books, we had our translators native speakers. So even in my childhood, I was, not in childhood, in my youth, I managed to see people from all over the world and to speak with them. So there was an American woman, a very old one, who came with her husband immediately after the revolution from America. And she contributed all her wealth to the revolution, to the Soviet Russia. The only thing from her wealth she had all her life was her wedding ring, nothing else. And she was so happy to maintain this style of life, simply because she was extremely romantic. Of course, later they realized what was happening, but unfortunately there was no way back. I don't know, did I answer your question or not?
Any other questions? Well, in that case, let's
Yeah.
thank Anna once again very much
Yeah.
indeed.
My pleasure. Thank you.